So thank you, everybody. My name is Mike Farnsworth. I'm actually with the Cross-Sector Digital Identity Initiative. We're also known as the AMBA pilot for many of you out there. And so I thought I'd give you a little insight into our pilot. I, too, am going to kind of run through some of the first parts of our topics fairly quickly, talk a little bit about what the pilot is, a little bit of a refresher of who our members are, what our key things are, give a little bit of summary of some of the milestones and achievements, talk a little bit about what we're getting ready to do for the next year, but then I want to spend a little bit more time on our outreach and collaboration efforts along with our lessons learned, and then probably spend the bulk of our time with our actual user experience, which is where we've actually been able to uncover quite a few of our lessons learned. Just to get a little insight, we are a public-private consortium. We have members from the public sector and the private sector involved in our pilot. We're chartered under the American Association of Motor Vehicle Administrators. We have involvement from the Commonwealth of Virginia, biometric signature ID. CA Technologies and Microsoft as well. And I'll talk a little about this and some of our lessons learned about some of the challenges that a consortium brings to the table. In a nutshell, our objective is an evolutionary approach. We first took a lens and looked at the capabilities around strong authentication, what that means, meaning some of the components that it takes in order to strengthen online credentials that are out there in the marketplace today. How we could augment that and make them a little bit stronger in the authentication flows, and ultimately resulting in a stronger credential that could be used for the relying parties. At the end of the day, one of the things that we know that's probably of great importance to the relying parties and to the ecosystem in a whole is how do we orchestrate all these together, bring all these authentication events, bring these stronger credentials, bring these verified attributes, and bring all these proofing events that come into play, and actually present it back to the relying party in a consolidated fashion that they can actually use. And all the while doing this, making sure that our trust framework evolves with us and that we remain constantly focused on user experience, which is probably one of the key focal points for where we're spending a lot of our time presently. So let me kind of talk very briefly about how we kind of componentized our pilot efforts. One of the key premises and tenets behind our proposal was not about creating a new credential, not about being a new identity provider, but how can we take the plethora of social credentials in varying strengths and varying levels, whether they be your commercially available social credentials, or whether they even be proprietary credentials that are used in specific communities of interest. And then how we can take that and augment them with verifiable and authoritative attributes that the user actually wants to present to the relying party, and do it in a privacy-enhancing fashion without ending up with data dumping or exposing more information than what the relying party either needs or what the actual user wants to expose. And then a third component has to do with the identity proofing aspects, exploring how we can leverage the rigorous identity proofing for in-person events, but also look at the remote proofing events as well, and couple all three of these together in order to meet our pilot objectives. We actually generalized our functional groupings into 4 core capabilities. All 4 of these are actually required for our pilot, which I'll be discussing in just a few minutes. But the first one really started tying together the identity provider and the attributes together in order that we could take these authoritative sources of information, couple them with, say, a social credential, and actually start to provide more value than what the social credential has alone. But it's important to note that that really only is 2 legs of the stool, because we really haven't tied it together with making sure that it's indeed the right person that's behind the glass or behind the keyboard. This is where we actually start going into capability 2, where we start introducing our remote proofing events and in-person proofing events so that we can tie them all together to support the third capability, which is we're actually able to holistically authenticate a full credential that's root comes from a social credential, augmented with this verified information, and then coupled with that proofing event. And then the fourth capability is actually tied around how can we aid and assist the relying parties in actually using this consolidated credential. It's one thing for them to have a contractual one-to-one relationship with a singular identity provider, but how do you actually enable a relying party to leverage multiple credential service providers, multiple identity providers, multiple attribute providers, all together holistically without compromising the privacy in between and allowing exposure. So we've kind of introduced several components to actually enable that. We've tied it all together. We have our traditional roles of our identity providers. We have our relying party. We've introduced some technology in the middle that acts as the orchestration and blinding engine. This is actually how we offer the isolation from the relying party to the identity providers, from the attribute providers, and then from the credential service providers, so that we ended up don't exposing data inadvertently. This model has actually been fairly successful in us getting through our PEM because it's enabled us to actually isolate the interaction models so that we can clearly determine where that information is being exchanged and how. A quick peek into our milestones and timeline. We are actually at the point where we are preparing for our final integration side with our pilot. Our relying party deployment is scheduled for April of this year. The first year was really focused around the technical viability. The second year is more focused around the pilot efforts, deploying to our relying party, and then preparing for the commercial marketplace. Some of the key achievements and accomplishments in August of this year is when we had successful integration of all the roles and participants. This is focused around our pilot use cases. We had drafted our trust framework. We've completed the first two capabilities. We're actually very well through capability 3 now. We've developed an assurance program. This is actually our mechanism for introducing additional participants into the ecosystem to actually support the use cases, not only for the pilot efforts, but also moving into the commercial marketplace. We spent a good amount of time on a relying party pipeline. We have over 15 relying parties in that pipeline, all in varying stages. So we kind of established a process that we can throttle adoption so we can focus on making sure that we deliver to our pilot objectives so we essentially don't get steered away from our first implementation. In order to make it a little bit easier, we provided some administrative onboarding guides and technical onboarding guides. The idea here is to kind of clear up any confusion that relying parties or other participants may have in order to kind of onboard to the ecosystem. We've done some operational consolidation, and we've actually established our governing board that will lead us through the pilot efforts. As far as outreach, we do have about 15 relying parties in the pipeline. We're exploring additional developing partners to fill specific roles, and a lot of these are in support of our actual pilot activities. Our year 2 plan, this started in October, wrapping up capabilities 3 and 4, introduction of the proofing components. Our pilot is actually focused on Inova Health System. We have 2 use cases that we're targeting with them, one being patient access to health records, and the other one being provider access to their electronic health record system. And I'm actually going to kind of walk through that user experience in just a few minutes and give you a little bit more insight into that pilot. We need to focus on the business plan development. As Kathy kind of alluded to, somebody has to pay for it. So we're working through the fee structure, the value proposition, and how it can be self-sustainable. April is our target for the Inova pilot. Once that actually goes into production, then we're going to be focusing on the commercial marketplace preparation and then beginning onboarding some additional relying parties. We spent a good amount of time with a lot of cross-pilot collaboration. You'll start to see that there's a lot of capabilities that are complementary of each other. So we're looking for as many opportunities as we can across the pilots to start integrating those capabilities in our pilot efforts. We have a very diverse relying party outreach program. We have government, higher education, banking, and healthcare. The folks in our consortium are actually very active in the ecosystem in the IDESG. We have folks that sit on many communities and do a lot of presentation and outreach to try to garner interest in what we're doing. So this is where I wanted to kind of get to really get to the meat of the matter. Some of the lessons learned that we've uncovered over the last year. The first one comes to being about the business case. I know Jeremy kind of alluded to this earlier. Relying party recruitment is a challenge. One of the things that we've been very successful with is making sure that we take a very holistic approach and really focusing on the business, the legal, and the technical components. Because all too often what we found is we'll go engage on one of the three legs, and while the other two may be involved in the periphery, if they're not actively engaged in the conversations, then you end up garnering support from one side of the organization, and then the other just kind of falls behind. And then getting that final commitment is actually very tough. Another thing that we've noticed is that it requires extensive line of business knowledge, meaning that, for us targeting the Inova health system, it really took an enormous amount of insight into patient process, patient flow, electronic health records, because it had to be made very apparent and germane to their day-to-day activities. And it's not all about identity. It's really about how you can enable them to do additional business processes and how you can streamline what they have and then strengthen the security behind it. And once that message is clear, then then you can focus on the legal and the technical components. And usually we found a lot of time the security concerns come under the technical arm. As far as the business plan, financial viability does exist. Most relying parties have a very significant investment in their identity management practices. Getting them to consider an external provider is tough, but if you can tailor it to their core lines of business and not to new revenue streams, it usually resonates fairly well with them. As far as our consortium members, we are actually a public-private partnership. Sometimes that actually has some cycle time mismatches. We have, different work streams that are driving to accomplish different features and different capabilities. And so, we're driving on a timeline for the grant. We have our participants and our relying parties who have sometimes a mismatch in scheduling because they have conflicting priorities. We are moving at a private sector pace when it comes to commercial marketplace viability, but yet we also know that we have the public sector lag that we have, around policy and statute and things like that we need to make sure that we bring into consideration. Sometimes that mismatch actually stall some activities, and you have to shuffle the cards in order to, deliver at certain things that you've committed to. The legal and business, the lawyers tend to move at a different pace than the actual business flows. The member interaction, we have folks that are very granular and very specific technology in the weeds. So sometimes we have to translate between the business folks and the technical folks. And the asks for some of the groups, since we're all not in one room at one time or one building or one organization, requires us to be very specific in contributions, meaning how you ask for certain information is critical as to whether you'll get it in a few hours or a few days. And then coming up with a common lexicon, a common vocabulary that we can use to share not only across the consortium members, but also from the relying parties. You can imagine you have conversations with government folks about government use cases, and you contrast that with a banking use case, and you contrast that with a healthcare use case. you can usually glean out a lot of the commonality, but some of them kind of sit on the fringes, and that's sometimes where all the devil's in the details. From a technical perspective, we're acknowledging that standards base is the key, meaning, you know, it kind of helps in that lexicon and that integration. Developing technologies are sometimes difficult to manage when you're driving on specific timelines or working to meet specific technical integration. When products are in differing levels of development, sometimes you have to adjust your schedule. IP protection in a consortium is sometimes a challenge. We have differing levels of intellectual property. A lot of them are, you know, a lot of our commercial providers are developing products, and so, you know, you get the same question as, you know, how do we protect our intellectual property, but how do we continue to move the endeavor and the pilot forward? We're very fortunate that our partners are very vested and very passionate about this, so that has actually played to our advantage. One thing I would suggest anyone that's looking into bringing commercial providers into a consortium like this is to make sure you have the right champions to support it, because they're the cheerleaders that actually push you forward. Multi-factor credential compatibility. We've noticed that some of these multi-factor credential service providers, some have proprietary mechanisms. So by leveraging the standards-based approach, we can actually drive adoption. Attributes and data information. There are some conflicting rules out there from the regulatory agencies about what you can use information for. You couple that with some perception of use from the public and from legislative arms, it brings up the questions about availability and permissible use, meaning can you use that information in order to actually meet commercial purposes, or if it's outside of your core line of business. From a trust framework perspective, we know that it's very politically charged. You know, we've been very fortunate that we've been looking at a lot of the different trust frameworks out there. There really isn't a consistent model to build upon. We know that there's a lot of work going on in the IDESG and other pilots to help with that. Building the trust framework from a foundation firmly set on the NSTIC and IDESG principles, and actually digging your heels in when necessary to stick to them. Talk about it from the business, legal, and technical aspects. Developing the trust framework collaboratively by engaging your participants, specifically the relying party, making sure that the right participant members are actually engaged, like your chief information security officers, your chief risk officers, your compliance folks, and your legal folks. And then legal review and privacy and compliance with applicable law is probably key. From a user experience, and I'm going to talk a little about this in the demo as I go through it very quickly, there's actually more complexity than it first appears. One of the success factors is by every participant having a common goal. It does accelerate the user experience development. It's usually what folks are very passionate about when they actually see something tangible. Doing it real time with the participants is key. We often have to make trade-offs in usability that have far-reaching effects. Sometimes we don't know what those are until we actually get into it and start evaluating them. And once we start evaluating across those interactions, we find that it affects our PEM, and then sometimes we have to go back and make additional compromises. So I really did want to actually show you very quickly some of our user experience work that we've done. This is specifically around the interaction with Inova Health System for MyChart. We're actually looking to work with them to use CSDII to actually authenticate them versus having their traditional user ID and password. If you notice our positioning here, we have prominently placed it within MyChart so that it becomes the premier authentication. The actual consent model comes around with we're going to explain to them what we're doing. We spent an enormous amount of time here around trying to balance the granularity of consent versus explaining to the user what's going to happen so that they don't get mired down in too many details, but they feel comfortable with what's happening. This is actually invoked from the relying party side. They actually, we've given them a roadmap of what they're going to have to do in order to complete the authentication. First, they're going to have to choose one of their web accounts, whether it be from Microsoft, whether it be from Google, Yahoo, or whichever ones. And these are all configurable by the relying party. The next step is around authenticating their information from their driver's license, meaning actually, going back and authenticating the information that they want verified. And I'm getting the next step in the process, once we've actually confirmed their attributes, is actually verifying their identity with the credential service provider. We actually have two different ones built in. The first one is out of band with a phone call. This is actually going back to their interaction with Inova, meaning that when they registered and became a patient, they provided primary methods of contact. So we actually will call them at their number that they already had previously established, and when the phone rings, they would acknowledge. Then we actually provide them the summary of what we're sending back to Inova. This is what we did, and then this is what we're actually sending back, and then they actually get redirected back to their to Inova, to my chart application.
Hi, Mike. Hi, Mike. This is Laura with the Secretariat. We're the 20 minutes is up. Oh, looks like you're about done anyway.
Perfect.
Yep, I was going to show the second one, but I was running through the questions.
Yeah, you did a great job. We are now taking questions, and I just want to tell everyone our few reminders about asking questions. You can either raise your hand by using the little hand icon under the participants panel, or you could also just chat your question if you want us to read it for you, or you could also chat and we'll make sure you're unmuted if you request via chat. If you're a phone user, you will need to have entered your attendee number in order to be unmuted. So please ask away. Thanks.
Did I drop from the, I don't know if I dropped from the, looks like I.
So first question is from Bob Pinero, who says, state DMVs seem like natural candidates for identity providers and credential issuers. Is a goal of this pilot to study the feasibility of state DMVs to act as IDPs or credential issuers for anyone with a driver's license or state-issued ID? And as a result of this pilot, will AMVA take a position as to the feasibility of state DMVs acting in this role?
Yeah, I think the short answer to that question is one of the values that we really see from the motor vehicle community comes to our the identity proofing that actually goes into issuing those credentials. So one of the goals of this is actually exploring what those challenges are. What does it mean for leveraging the identity proofing? What does it mean for leveraging the attributes? And all of that is being factored into our, into our trust framework and into our lessons learned. I think the key piece, part of your question that you may be, looking at finding an answer to, comes to, are we looking to actually be an identity provider? And I think the short answer to that is, our goal of the pilot is to actually augment these other existing identities that are out there with the value that we have, not necessarily going out and taking a stance, and actually pushing out to be a commercial identity provider.
So in other words, you guys see your real value as being an entity that can provide validated attributes rather than provide the whole solution.
Exactly, as well as the actual identity proofing that goes into issuing those credentials. How can you leverage that proofing event and expose it to add more value to these social creds? That was the real premise behind our behind the pilot.
Great. Other questions? There's always one or two that pop up. Here we go. The problem is the enrollment process. This is from Robert Farron. The problem is the enrollment process for DMVs, and is this a factor in the pilot process? Will there be transparency in the process?
Yes, and you're hitting on one of the challenges that we've definitely acknowledged is, how can you standardize on that enrollment process? AMVA has a lot of work around the identity proofing process. I know that there's we're very active, and AMVA is very active in some of the work that NASPO has been doing around the identity proofing. And you're right, the standardization of that process across all jurisdictions is important because that's actually how you can ensure continuity and equivalency across all of them.
All right, the next question was from Aaron Seib, who asked, what's the net gating factor for this kind of solution being ubiquitous? Is it a gap in standards, or are there other issues that you guys need to deal with?
Well, a lot of them, it comes down to one of the things around perception of use. What are you actually doing? Standardization is one that is there, that is a challenge. How can we articulate it in a fashion that not only the public sector understands, but also how the private sector understands, because they often are conflicting in how those standards are interpreted. So a lot of work around that is something that's definitely needed in order for us to fully launch it.
Yeah. Although there's been, if I can weigh in for a minute, there's been, some controversy within the DMV community over the years in terms of whether DMVs really are in the identity business or not. And I think this pilot is a pretty notable evolution of that position or that debate.
Exactly.
So we have another question from ISW. It says, when you verify the applicant's DMV data, do you connect directly with the DMV, or do you access it via the AMVA IT systems? In the sample screen, the user info at the end included a photo. Was this from the DMV or uploaded by the user? It's probably where you should explain AMVANet a bit.
Yeah, so that's actually a multi-part question. So the answer to the first one is that when we actually connect for verification purposes, and this is actually one of the keys, is that we're actually not exchanging any data. The purpose of using AMVA is for verification of the information. So, for example, I'm Mike Farnsworth. I'm attesting that I'm Mike Farnsworth, and I'm a resident of the Commonwealth of Virginia, and I'm voluntarily providing my information. It actually goes to AMVA. And with AMVA, we're actually connected with all 50 states, Canadian provinces, and U.S. territories. And then it actually goes to the appropriate jurisdiction for a match, no match. In other words, we're not asking a jurisdiction to send my driving record or to send my vehicle record back. We're simply verifying and giving that thumbs up as to whether or not they've actually been verified. And then that is actually transmitted back through AMVA to our privacy-enhancing technology provider, where we can actually transform that based on the policy. So, for example, I may be saying what my date of birth is. It goes, verifies it against my driving record, gives me a thumbs up, but what's actually presented to the relying party is just the fact that I'm over the age of 18. As far as that picture, that actually comes from the relying party application. When you got to that last screen, that's all information that's housed within the relying party. It's not representative of what's actually exchanged. The only thing that's really exchanged is the authentication and the claims that we represent on that final confirmation screen before we're passed back to the relying party.
Thanks. There's a question which I don't know if you can answer. How will this be priced for the healthcare industry? You guys don't have that figured out yet, do you?
No, we certainly don't have that figured out. And this kind of goes to some of those activities around the second year around the cost model and the business plan. We're working very actively with the health IT community to really get an understanding about what identity costs them and what the value is. And so, yes, so that's actually part of our year two activities, is really determining what that cost value is and some of the models that can be used for pricing it in that industry.
Thanks. Another question, have you considered using photos from the DMV and comparing them to the records in order to improve the level of assurance?
It's definitely been considered, but as far as viability, there you start getting into a lot more privacy questions and concerns that we're probably not prepared to tackle right now. Because when you get to there, you're actually starting to exchange biometric type data. So that has definite implications. They're probably a little bit farther than the pilot, but
All right. There's a few other questions, but we're also unfortunately needing to stay on time to wrap by 5. So if I can ask folks who've got questions if they can hold them in the queue so we get a chance to talk a little bit more. And let me move on to our next presentation, which is Dave Cox from ID Data Web. And thanks again, Mike.